We have Matthew Segall with us today. Matt, I consider you as kind of like this prominent public figure and expert in Whitehead, but I feel like maybe that's because of the bubbles that I live in. Would you consider, like, how public of and well-known of a figure do you feel like you are?
Well, I don't know who came up with the phrase "this little corner of the internet," but for those interested in Whitehead and adjacent topics, I guess I tend to come towards the top of the Google search page. So yeah, I don't know. I think I do some pretty obscure stuff, so famous is not really a word that I would use.
Well, every time I think about, like, would I ask about Whitehead, I always think of you, but I also don't want to keep bothering you on social media whenever I have questions. But I was curious, actually, do you consider yourself a Whiteheadian? Because I know you've taken his models and evolved them in your own way. So I'm kind of curious about how, you relate to Whitehead's specific formulation of process ontology and philosophy.
Yeah, that's kind of a hard question. Do I consider myself a Whiteheadian? Because on the one hand, it's like, obviously, yes, he's probably, well, certainly the most influential philosopher for me. But at the same time, I wouldn't want to give the impression that I'm a Whitehead partisan, or that I don't think he might be wrong or misguided or about some things. I mean, he's hard to find bones to pick with, but I wouldn't want to give the impression by adopting the label Whiteheadian that I'm incapable of thinking beyond a Whiteheadian box. He's created quite a roomy box, but at the same time, if anything, I would prefer to be thought of as a process philosopher, which is a broader tradition and approach, meta-philosophical approach that goes back to the origins of philosophy itself. And there's a whole attitude that comes along with that. And one of those attitudes would be, don't get boxed in and stuck thinking in terms of isms or, schools guided by one particular great genius. But I'll wear the label lightly as a sticker that I can peel off as needed.
Perfect. I was really curious, actually. We're connected on social media, and one of your most recent comments, you mentioned trying to avoid both naturalism and spiritualism as words and trying to find sort of a unified ground in terms of explanations. And this kind of really reminded me of Descartes' split between mind and matter. And it sounds like you're trying to find ways that these concepts are actually complementary, and that maybe that there's a unified metaphysics that kind of explains both. And this led my thinking to this sounds like a theory of everything, or an attempt at a theory of everything, at least a metaphysical theory of everything. And that sounded very Whiteheadian as well. And I feel like, or would you consider Whitehead's Model A theory of everything?
Well, it's certainly a comprehensive cosmology that, as he put it, intended, his intent was to provide a scheme of categories that could adequately describe every possible experience that we might have, whether it's within science, within religion and spirituality, within art, within everyday life. And so that's a theory of everything. But I think obviously broader than just what gets called a theory of everything or a grand unifying theory in physics. This is meant to encompass the whole of human interest and concern and outlook, not just natural science. But I think, I'm also tempted, just as I would, try to bring that balancing polarity and avoid just saying, oh, well, we have to be naturalistic, because, I would wonder about where's the place of spirit in that. And I wouldn't want to go in the opposite direction from naturalism and say, oh, I'm a spiritualist, even if I think spirit is just as real as nature in some sense. But in terms of a theory of everything, I'm tempted to also say, hey, well, what about nothing? We need to talk about nothing, even if we're going to sort of performatively unsay what we say about nothing. But Whitehead has a term, creativity, which is his ultimate category. And I think one of the words used traditionally, going back in Western philosophy and theology, and especially negative theology, mystical theology, for what Whitehead means by creativity would be nothingness, but a kind of fecund or fertile nothingness from out of which everything issues. And so, yeah, we can call it a theory of everything, but we shouldn't forget that there's more or less than everything, depending on how you want to talk about it. So nothing has a role to play here as well.
Yeah. So that, in that sense, it's like an evolving theory of everything, or like, would it even be called a theory of everything? I've coined, I don't know if I coined it, but there's a term that I like to use, which is a theory of unified metaphysics, where rather than a theory of everything.
And people are putting meta in front of different things now to signal like a even broader and more going beyond any prior limits. But, there's a sense in which there are no things anymore in Whitehead's cosmos, right? There are events, there are processes, there are creative happenings, actual occasions. And, we can redefine what we mean by thing, or really emphasize the gerund, and throw that into process. But yeah, just playing with words here, but I think it's important to get the full sense of he's a systematic philosopher who wants to include everything, but also it's an open system. The universe itself is unfinished. So of course our attempts to know the nature of that universe are also going to remain unfinished. So theory of everything can sound a little hubristic. That's what we're aiming for, but lest we become a little bit too full of ourselves, I doubt we'll finally succeed in tying up all the loose ends.
Yeah, Corey said something similar in his project. The Arc Disciplinary Research Project, it has a similar attitude, or at least he did, around not assuming that we have the answers yet, but finding the frameworks which help people come together and figure that stuff out. And the way that you describe Whitehead's universe, it definitely sounds more like an organism of relationships as opposed to rules and points, or it's an interesting, I guess, rejection of, and this is a question I'm not even sure, but I know Whitehead seems to be rejecting some of the maybe more popular philosophies of his time. Is that right? Like the substance philosophies of and maybe we can get into that now.
Yeah.
In fact, like more about Whitehead and his history.
Yeah. So, he starts out as a mathematician, right? And he works with Bertrand Russell, who began as his student at Cambridge and quickly became his collaborator, working on the Principia Mathematica to ground mathematics in logic, the logic of set theory. And they completed 3 volumes of that. And I like to say it was both a great success and a great failure. It was a success in that it really helped to inaugurate this new analytic method of philosophy, and to bring symbolic logic and new forms of predicate logic to bear on philosophical problems and the clarification of our propositions to know what we're even talking about. And yet, on the other hand, the project was a failure because they ran into a bunch of paradoxes, basically, that they tried to find patches for, simply to prove that 1 + 1 = 2, which intuitively a child can, an elementary school child knows that that's true. And yet to prove that with no presuppositions and without there needing to be any intuitive leaps, it turned out to be impossible. And it wasn't for a few decades until Kurt Gödel came along and laid out his incompleteness theorems that it was rigorously shown why it was impossible to ground math in logic. Russell went on from that project and got quite enamored with Ludwig Wittgenstein and his Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, and that had a major influence on the Vienna Circle and logical positivism, even though Wittgenstein himself was like, you guys don't understand what I'm actually talking about. And so Russell continued, trying to find this, logical atomism was his project. Like he really wanted to pursue a scientistic form of philosophizing, even though he was a realist about, he was a Platonic realist about like ideas and took morality very seriously. Nonetheless, he was pursuing the analytic approach. Whitehead, on the other hand, recognized what the failure of the Principia meant, I think, at a deeper level, and started to ask deeper metaphysical questions in the 19-teens, at the same time that physics was undergoing a second major revolution. I mean, it was really the second scientific revolution in many senses, both with Einstein and relativity theory and the beginnings of quantum theory. Whitehead recognized, and he was always interested in not just pure mathematics, but applied mathematics. He learned mathematics at Cambridge from James Clerk Maxwell's student. Maxwell invented electromagnetic theory. And one of his students was Edward John Ruth, I think is his name. And that was Whitehead's teacher. So he's one removed from Maxwell, who's a brilliant mathematician, but obviously applying mathematics to what can be the patterns that can be measured in the physical world. And so Whitehead always had that sense that, hey, math is applicable. And he was very interested in how it was relevant to physics. And so he was one of the few mathematicians alive at the time in the 19-teens who could even comprehend what Einstein was proposing. So much so that he even had some criticisms of it. And he voiced those to Einstein in the early 1920s. We could get into that later if you want. But, for all of these reasons, both because of the limits of logic and because of these shifts in physics, Whitehead found himself wandering into philosophy, and eventually in 1924, he was invited to Harvard to teach philosophy, even though he'd never actually taken a philosophy course himself. He says in his first Harvard lecture that this is actually my first philosophy course, and I happen to be teaching it, but I'm not trained as a philosopher. But very often major paradigm shifts in a discipline over here are catalyzed by somebody coming from elsewhere, from a different discipline, and shaking things up. I think Whitehead's very much doing that. He was a very close reader of the history of philosophy and had been studying it on his own, including reading Kant's Critique of Pure Reason when he was a college student as part of the Cambridge Apostles, I think they called themselves, this group that would meet to do extracurricular reading and study late into the night. And he claims that at that point he was reading Kant so deeply that he had memorized whole passages, and so he was always conversant, to say the least, with the history of philosophy, and a deep reader of Plato. But I think, unlike Russell, who pursued this form of logical atomism, Whitehead was way more of an organic and holistic thinker. He took the tools of propositional logic as far as they could go, but he was a constructive system builder who was engaging in the mid-19 and late 1920s in a form of speculative metaphysics and cosmology at a time when philosophy in the Anglo-American world, at least, was going in a very different direction. And also continental philosophy was going in a very different direction with people like Heidegger. Being in Time is published in 1929, I believe, same year as Process and Reality. But Heidegger's project is, I think, represents a different form of narrowing, in my opinion, to the analytic, logical, positivist approach, in that it's focused more on human being, whereas Whitehead was focused more on the cosmos at large, with the human as a expression of that, right? And Whitehead took science very seriously, whereas Heidegger didn't. So Whitehead's doing a very different thing that was very unpopular at the time, and for the better part of the last century, his work's been in cold storage, but it's really beginning to heat up now because there's a lot more interest. The zeitgeist has changed. So,
What do you think has changed that has led to Whitehead coming back into the popular domain?
I mean, a century of making absolutely no progress on the foundations of physics after quantum theory blew up the old mechanistic materialist picture. The ecological crisis, I think, is forcing us to reimagine how the human being relates to the rest of the natural world. It seems like a reductionistic understanding of life, of ecosystems, of the intrinsic value of the living world is part of what has led us to go about destroying that world. And so there's more recognition of the importance of an alignment between our deep values as human beings and our what we think we know about the non-human world, which in Whitehead's point of view would be the source of so many of our values. We didn't just make them up whole cloth as human beings because we're so special. It's like, no, actually, there are these deep cosmic values that we inherit. And so these types of integrative thinking and, trying to bring the human being back in touch with the natural world are leading people to look again at Whitehead's ideas.
We've been sharing some different social media circles like integral and metamodernism spaces. And Whitehead seems, at least in the metamodernism space, Whitehead seems quite favorable to a lot of people. Obviously not everyone, but you seem to take a kind of more integral approach. Like the description you just gave felt like an integral description almost, or like hints of it in terms of society's changes and things that have happened. And maybe, would you agree there's some kind of or do you even enjoy using the integral terminology anymore? Of like the stages have come online, and that I don't know, maybe there's more. Just simply put it, systems thinking, the systems thinking revolution of some kind. I don't know if that's still. Again, my bubbles are small, so it feels like that's happening to me, but I don't know how real that is.
I take integral theories. I'll pluralize it because there are different lineages there, and I take them very seriously. I think that they still have a lot to teach. Yeah, I take it very seriously. I don't so much lead from that orientation, but I think understanding human consciousness is a developmental process over the lifetime that goes beyond just, a sense of, egocentric identity, but continues into world-centric and then even more transpersonal forms of identity and relationship, autonomy and communion, as Wilbur would say. But I have a lot of caution, and I proceed very carefully when it comes to thinking about cultural evolution and the evolution of consciousness over historical time. I mean, it's impossible not to, for me at least, look at human history and not see these broad mutations or shifts in the general outlook or the Weltanschauung of peoples. But I think it's probably more complicated than any sort of linear or even spiralic kind of story, because it's so easy, for example, as Westerners, where integral theory was born, to view all of history as sort of leading to us, when there are a lot of other lines, lineages, that one might discover if, say, one were to develop a account of the evolution of consciousness from as an Indian person, or as an African or a Chinese person. Like, you would tell a very different story, I would imagine. Maybe not totally different, but I think that type of cross-cultural work remains to be done in an integral way, and I hope it can be done. But that would bring some needed complexification and nuance to what can often sound like a rather self-serving type of story, right? So I think there's something to it, but I think we need to proceed with caution.
That makes sense. Would you say that Whitehead's framing could provide a unifying foundation for something like integral? Like I can imagine, for example, the axes of the quadrants are singular, plural, internal, external, sort of could emerge nicely from an actual occasion, for example, which if you don't know the terminology, we'll get to that later.
Well, I think for sure. I mean, actually, Wilbur drew a lot on Whitehead to develop the equal model. So Whitehead is already kind of the foundation for it. Wilbur has some criticisms of Whitehead in regards to intersubjectivity or the lack thereof that he finds in Whitehead's work. But it's kind of a technical issue in terms of we need to unpack Whitehead's metaphysics first in order to understand Wilbur's criticism and whether or not it's a misunderstanding, as I think it is. But in any event, yeah, there's so much Whitehead already in at least Wilbur's integral theory. So,
who were Whitehead's kind of direct forebears, and like who inspired Whitehead kind of most directly in terms of his ontology and cosmology?
Most influential, probably Plato. Maybe tied, if not second, would be William Wordsworth, the poet. William James would be there in the top three, and the French philosopher Henri Bergson would be up there as well. So let's see, that's four. Is there anyone else? I mean, I could start listing more names, but I feel like then I'd have to create quite a long list. But so let's stay with those four.
No, that's a good start. Like someone told me that Whitehead was heavily influenced by Leibniz. Do you see parallels between Leibniz methodology and Whitehead's process, or the way that he describes the fundamental actual occasions of reality?
Yeah, he draws that parallel himself to Leibniz's monads. Leibniz's his ontology is pluralistic, and Whitehead also calls his own ontology pluralistic and opposes it to a kind of Spinozistic monism. But Whitehead is different from both Spinoza and Leibniz in that they were both thinking in terms of substance. And so whether we're talking about Spinoza's monism or Leibniz's monadology, the logic is a substantialist logic, a non-relational logic, which is to say, for Leibniz, his monads were windowless, which is to say, it's not that there's no windows and the air is just rushing in. It's windowless as in they're walled off. There's no opening. There's no porousness to causal influence from the surrounding world. Each monad is self-enclosed, and it's as if there's a pre-programmed reality tunnel inside of each monad that God set in place. With Leibniz thinks in terms of a pre-established harmony of these monads. So the monads don't causally interact, but God arranged them in advance perfectly such that everything unfolds in this orchestrated way, and each monad experiences its world as if it were in relationship to other monads. But in some sense, it's like this holographic illusion where each one has its own little virtual reality running. That's very different from Whitehead's understanding of actual occasions, which are almost all window. And are prehensively related to one another. Prehension is Whitehead's one of his neologisms, which means a feeling. It's how that over there becomes here. It's how the past enters again into the present. and how actual occasions relate to one another. So every actual occasion contains the entire past from the universe unified in it from its perspective, right? And God is not prearranging everything in advance. God is along for Whitehead has a God, but God's along for the ride with every other actual entity. And so there's a parallel there, and actually it's very helpful to know a bit about Leibniz before reading Whitehead, so you can have at least some sense for the sort of perspectival, pluralistic cosmology he's articulating. But there are these important differences, right? Whitehead's thinking in terms of process and relationship instead of substance, and that makes all the difference.
Yeah, and certainly apart from the notion of like the divine splendor of isolation that you find in relation to the monads that makes them windowless, that's definitely a big difference. But at the same time, like I was struck by the parallel with the concept of pre-established harmony in the sense of the way that everything else in the universe enters into, each actual entity, actual occasion, the concrescence. Because even though it's not like all there from the beginning, so there's no need for the interaction, it still is almost like every actual entity like anticipates within itself everything else in the entire universe that is the case.
Anticipates, I mean, it feels the past, everything that's occurred before, and it anticipates, though, probably a selection among the possibilities available to be realized in the next moment.
Mm-hmm.
But, Whitehead still, you're right, though, that Whitehead uses this notion of a pre-established harmony to understand how the multiplicity of prehensions within a concressing actual occasion, and I'm just dropping a bunch of Whitehead jargon here on everybody, sorry. But he talks about how these prehensions that grow together to form a new actual occasion in the process of concrescence are mutually sensitive to one another, and then it's as if there's a pre-established harmony.
Yeah.
From the perspective of the subject, which is finally achieved as a result of this process of concrescence.
Yeah, there's actually, there was a quote, because I was, reading it recently, Process and Reality, in preparation for the interview. There was a quote that particularly I was thinking of, which I have written down actually, which is, thus, in another sense, each actual entity includes the universe by reason of its determinate attitude towards every element in the universe. Yeah.
Right.
That was the thing that really felt to me. It's like that just reminds me intuitively of a notion of pre-established harm.
Right. I think in Whitehead, there's still this holographic sense that each contains all. That every actual occasion is a unique recapitulation of the universe. And, for Whitehead, harmonization of what would otherwise be conflicting feelings into aesthetic contrasts in the process of concrescence, so as to give rise to a subjective perspective, is what he's describing as a pre-established harmony. Because paradoxically for Whitehead, there are no subjects having experiences. In other words, there aren't subjects that pre-exist the prehensions that they have of the rest of the universe. The subject is a outgrowth of its prehensions. Whitehead also refers to a superject. He always wants to hyphen subject, superject, to emphasize the sense in which the subject is the result of a process of experience rather than what substance-like is there in advance having experience. And so the reason he has to refer to a pre-established harmony is because it's as if there's a subjective aim that's drawing these prehensions together into the formation of a subject or subject superject, as if it were already there, but it's not yet achieved until the end of the concrescence. And so, he's drawing on this, he's using this Leibnizian reference or allusion to give voice to an important part of his own metaphysics, but it functions differently than it does for Leibniz.
I'd love to take a quick step back because we're getting quite technical now, and
Sorry.
I really wanted to. No, it's fine. It's great. I mean,
There's no easy way into Whitehead. So.
Yeah. Well, I can always sort of cut the conversation that just happened to after a conversation to get the audience up to speed for those that need it. But
when I was at summer camp, they just pushed me in the pool and I learned to swim. So
well,
maybe we should start in the deep end and
needed.
Save people now.
Yeah. Well, I have a question actually, Matt, on Whitehead today. How accessible do you think Whitehead is to kind of a modern day philosopher wanting to get into process ontology and philosophy?
No more or less accessible than Kant or Hegel or Heidegger. It's a real work of philosophy, and whenever a real work of philosophy appears, you're not going to understand it the first time you read it. Even a academic philosopher is going to need to reread and really commit to learning a language. And, you know, there's a reason that academic philosophy becomes fragmented in a way that, you know, there are Heideggerians and there are Derridians and Whiteheadians, because it's like it takes a lifetime of study to really get the inside and outside of the inner workings of another philosopher's mind of a caliber like a Whitehead or Heidegger or Hegel. And so is he accessible? Yeah, but you have to work for it. And Whitehead presents a unique challenge, admittedly, because he's so many of his claims, his insights are coming from a variety of disciplines, mathematics, the work he did with Russell on propositional logic, and physics and biology and the history of religious experience. And, you know, so you have to have at least be conversant with all of these different fields in order to see the synthetic argument that he's trying to make. And it's not very common that someone has that type of breadth.
So it's almost like we need a community of experts as opposed to one person trying to figure it all out.
I actually recommend that people study Whitehead in groups for that reason. Don't do it by yourself.
That's a good recommendation. Maybe we can get into more specifics around Whitehead's rhetoric and his model.
Maybe a good place to start is like, what are some terms that the audience should know, do you think, Matt, if we're going to understand the discussion that we're going to have about Whitehead's ideas?
Yeah. Well, I talked about creativity already, which is his ultimate category. And that is a word that's difficult to define because it's everything and nothing. He says it's both one and many. What's that?
I was just going to say, I actually thought you gave a more lucid definition of it than I was able to find in the work itself. So, you know, you've done it, you know, helped already in terms of giving me some access to what's being talked about there. But yeah.
Oh, great. Glad to hear that. You know, elsewhere he'll talk about the principle of creative unrest, and it's that which is constantly disturbing any sense of settled finality. But it's, as I said, it's both many and one. It's no more disjunctive than it is conjunctive, and it gives rise to the next important term, which would be concrescence. And concrescence is this process, as Whitehead defines it in this neat little formula. It's the process whereby the many become one and are increased by one. So it's an iterative process. It's like a cycling process, and it's a cumulative process in that each subsequent concrescence includes the concrescence that came before it. And so there's this kind of a nesting of perspectives that goes on as the universe creatively advances. And so concrescence is the key concept of Whitehead's whole mature metaphysics.
Can you give an example of concrescence in nature?
Yeah. The realization of a pulse of light, a photon would be an example of concrescence. Psychologically, it's the most minute moment of experience that we can imagine that would involve some degree of, and I'll use Edmund Husserl's terms, retention of the past and protension of the future. So some degree of memory and some degree of anticipation. And it's not that Whitehead's suggesting that our stream of consciousness is some kind of a cartoon flip book with like freeze frames that create the illusion of motion. That would be what Bergson criticizes as the cinematographic reduction of what is really in a kind of unbroken flow. Whitehead's trying to point out, though, that our experience as conscious psychological creatures is analogous to quantum phenomena, like a pulse, a wavicle, if you want, of light, in the sense that it requires a certain duration for a concrete occasion of any kind, again, whether photonic or psychological, to fully manifest as itself. And so reality for Whitehead is made of these drops of experience that concress. They arise out of a past and integrate their feelings of that past with alternative possibilities that remain available. And then the process of concrescence is also a process of decision and winnowing down of what can occur next, which involves all sorts of aesthetic or felt affective processes. And when that decision is made, the reason he says the many become one or increased by one is because after arising and integrating all these feelings, a concrescence perishes. It transitions from subjective immediacy to objective immortality, and then is available for the next round of concrescence to prehend and make something new out of. And so this description Whitehead intended to apply across all scales, from, again, the quantum realm to the biological realm. You can think of concrescence as a way of understanding cellular mitosis, or moment by moment, the metabolic self-production that organisms are engaged in, many becoming one. And you can understand our own psychological experience in terms of these moments of concrescence, right? That's what Whitehead's aiming for with his categories, is a scheme that applies across all of these levels.
It reminds me of Heraclitus' ever-changing fire, and there's this sort of sense of a redefinition of, or not a redefinition of time, but like a rejection of this sense of block time, where the things exist in some kind of time-like space over there, and you can kind of walk to another point in time, and instead it's not like a flip book where there's segments of nows, but there's just this ongoing unfolding of now, and that creativity you described feels like the dance of the now moving, well, becoming. There's also, you mentioned how things feel, and Whitehead uses this word prehension, and that would you say that's kind of like a unit of qualia, like, or some kind of maybe even more fundamental, but it reminds me of qualia in terms of how it feels.
It bears some resemblance to this notion of qualia, but it's quite different. Qualia comes right out of a substance ontology. Qualia are intrinsic properties. And so if, Whitehead's ontology is process relational, what it's an alternative to would be the substance property or substance quality ontology, where there are these substances that have essential or accidental qualities which inhere in them, on them. And so that's why usually we tend to speak in terms of this or that type of being having consciousness or having conscious experiences. What we're saying is there is a substance with qualities attached to it. And qualia comes out of that. And most philosophers of mind, when they refer to qualia, they're trying to get at the intrinsic nature of consciousness. And already that's different from Whitehead, who would think that experience has a relational nature, not an intrinsic. It's not the intrinsic property of some isolated substance. Prehension is precisely pointing to the relational aspect of our experience. It's something that occurs between beings, if you want, rather than in separate beings. And philosophers of mind also say that qualia, when they want to point out the intrinsic nature of consciousness in terms of qualia, they want to insist that qualia has no function. Because as soon as you admit that qualia has a function, then the functionalists come along and say, oh, well, we can just explain it in terms of what it does in the brain. But the whole point, the whole reason that the people who defend the idea of qualia reference it is that they want to say there's this hard problem of consciousness, that there's something left over that the functionalist account leaves out, that even if we had a complete neurophysiological understanding of how the brain operates, and what inputs lead to what outputs, and how, behaviorally and biologically, how everything works, there would still be this qualia thing, this what it's likeness that's left over. And prehension is different from that, because prehensions do function. They have a function. They do something. They're how feelings are transmitted from one occasion of experience, from one actual occasion to another. And they influence the occasions that they are transferred to. They do function. And so it's really there is an experiential quality to it. And so it's like qualia in that sense, but prehension assumes a very different metaphysical background that is, again, process relational, rather than the substance property background or metaphysics that qualia is implying.
I know that Whitehead has this mathematical background. Did he apply his mathematical knowledge to these processes in some explicit way?
Yeah. In some sense, all like process in reality he describes it in the first few pages as a matrix, where there are these categories that he wants to be understood as applying analogously across different domains of experience. It's you could say, well, he's just using a mathematical metaphor, but he's really describing a process of mapping, of many-to-one relationships and one-to-many relationships. And, I'm not an expert by any means in advanced mathematics like category theory or graph theory or these things, but I think that would be what's going on methodologically for Whitehead, that he is really applying a mathematical method to metaphysics, but he's a constructive mathematician, which is to say there's no closure here. He's not pretending to provide a formula in terms of which everything can be explained, or whereby the universe might be calculated. He's using a mathematical analogy, but for him, rationality itself is really a method of analogy. And that's what knowledge is all about, is making analogies between this and that, something we know and something we don't know, and seeing if the analogy illuminates anything. So mathematics is there in the background for sure.
Would you say that his use of mathematics is purely analogous, or is there some level of isomorphism to the mathematics and what's happening?
There's definitely some level of isomorphism, and there's a whole part 4 of Process and Reality, which is a notoriously difficult chapter where Whitehead is almost, some would say, founding this new discipline of mereotopology, which is like the study of the relationships among wholes and parts in terms of how they might overlap and be adjacent to each other. And he's really trying to articulate a new description of a form of extension that's more general than four-dimensional space-time that the relativistic physics of his time was working on. It's more general than, in fact, any metrical geometry. It's more of a projective form of geometry from which any metrical form of geometry could be derived. And so there's some pretty intense mathematics going on right in process and reality, literal mathematics that a poor humanities guy like me has a tough time making sense of.
Mm. It sounds almost like an emergent space-time structure of some kind. Is that accurate?
The idea would be that the space-time, the three-dimensional space plus one dimension of time that relativistic physics works in would be emergent from this more primary type of extension that could lead to different dimensional fields or morphologies, Whitehead would say. And so, and he even says our universe might appear, adequately measured in this 3 or plus 1 dimensional Minkowskian type of Einsteinian space-time, but it might be evolving towards a higher dimensional form. We shouldn't assume that, first of all, we shouldn't assume that any one geometry is the way that the physical world is actually structured. It turns out that there are multiple geometries that might reveal something interesting to us about the structure of the physical world. So Whitehead's a conventionalist in that sense. That, I don't collapse geometry with physics. Geometry is a way of measuring, and there might be multiple useful ways of measuring the physical world. But also, even if the physical world does have some kind of, obviously has some kind of morphological structure to it, it could be continuing to morph and evolve in ways that require increasing the dimensionality of the types of geometrical tools that we apply to it.
That's super fascinating. I feel like I could go on a massive tangent here and try and discover more about Whitehead in relation to different scientific concepts. Like in quantum mechanics, we have quantum field theory. And do you feel like that Whitehead can explain that, or does the system encapsulate that in some way?
He's definitely thinking with what were then the very new discoveries coming out of quantum physics in the 1920s. Can he explain it? I think he provides a more adequate metaphysical context wherein the anomalies of quantum physics, anomalies for a more or less materialistic way, a mechanistic way of understanding the universe. He provides a way in which we can understand non-locality and entanglement, and the role that potentiality plays in nature. He provides a more coherent account of how all of that fits together without needing to, imagine some kind of magic, like conscious observers are making the moon just be in one place, and when we don't look at it, it's everywhere. The weird things that come out of trying to make sense of quantum physics without digging deeply enough into the metaphysical presuppositions to really know what we're talking about. So he goes as deep as you can go, I think. And if you can follow him there and then you come back to the surface again, I think quantum physics stops being as paradoxical and starts just being how the universe works.
That sounds nice to have that sense of groundedness with it.
That does sound
sorry, Insinq, did you have a question?
No, I said that does sound nice. I think quantum physics is one of the most baffling subjects that there is. So.
Yeah. Maybe we can come back to some more of Whitehead's rhetoric and
just I wanted to because I feel like there's one term we didn't really iron out, which is like an actual occasion or an actual entity. How would you define that?
So Whitehead's one way of describing his ontology is an event ontology, and event for Whitehead is a slightly more general term than actual occasion. But an actual occasion would be his attempt to provide an answer to the question that comes up in ontology: what is a thing? What is it that exists? I said earlier, thing implies typically, because of our materialistic common sense, just a hunk of stuff that that's inert and just hanging out until something happens to it. Actual occasions are agents. They are experiential. He refers to them as experience, NTS at the end of that, experience, like beings of experience, that, as I was describing before, have a certain temporal depth to them. But it's not metrical time. When I say temporal depth, it's more like Bergsonian duration, not clock time. In other words, you can't measure the time it takes an actual occasion to become itself. Whitehead would say clock time or measurable time is a result of a series of these actual occasions. And he refers to a series of actual occasions as a society of actual occasions or historical root of actual occasions. And so it's important to note that most of what we experience, the enduring bodies, including our own bodies, other people's bodies, all the animals and plants, the minerals, the artifacts, coffee mugs, these are actually not actual occasions. These are societies of actual occasions. In other words, they are a historical root of actual occasions that are inheriting a certain form, a pattern, a characteristic that they repeat moment by moment by moment, so as to maintain the form of the mug or form of our bodies. And there are societies within societies of actual occasions going up and down the whole scale of the cosmos. But with actual occasion, Whitehead's trying to give us as metaphysicians some referent whereby we could give an answer to the question, what exists? What is most concretely real, right? And so among the actual entities or actual occasions, those are synonyms for Whitehead, that we might want to include on our list of examples of actual occasions or entities would be everything from God to Whitehead says, a puff of smoke in far off empty space, to a moment of experience in the life history of a human being. These are all actual entities. And one of the implications here is that Whitehead wants the same set of categories that describe this process of becoming in terms of actual entities. He wants the same set of categories to apply to us as human beings in our experience, to the rest of the natural world, to God, and so on. And so it's, he says the world is composed of actual occasions. Right? So when we ask, what is the world made of? That's the answer. It's not made of matter. It's not made of particles. It's not made of just ideas either. It's made of these agents, these experiential, creative beings who realize a perspective on the world and then perish to give that perspective back to the world to become part of the next occasion that arises.
It's beautiful. Well, what would you say is Whitehead's most important concept, in the sense of like, what idea of his do you think it's important for people to know or deserves to be more widely understood?
It's a hard question. I mean, I'm tempted to ask you, what do you think? But I mean,
it is a hard question. Yeah, I'll have a think about
it. What do you think, Alexander? Do you have anything on that one? I mean, I'll come up with something, but it's.
I mean, if we start with an actual entity or actual occasion, the processes that they embody, I think, are like maybe an actual, because it kind of, all the processes emerge out of when you ask, what is it, an actual occasion, and what's it doing? Then it feels like the rest of his ontology comes through there in some way.
Yeah. I think I would say the most important idea you can take away from Whitehead is that the universe is alive, that life is a matter of degrees, but there's no 0 point. Everything has some degree of animacy, some degree of interiority and agency. And so, we inhabit, one of my other important influences, who was also influenced by Whitehead, was Thomas Berry, American theologian and philosopher. And he has this great phrase. He says, "The universe is not a collection of objects. It is a communion of subjects." And I think that basic intuition, that we live in amidst a cosmic community of other beings of various kinds, of innumerable kinds, and that, we as human beings are participants in a very ancient process of evolution, and that everything we do moment by moment in our individual lives and as a collective, as a species, will ramify into the future to affect the community members that will, take over from us. And so it's both, I think, a tremendous gift to realize that we are the inheritors of all of this brilliance, but also it's a tremendous responsibility, because what we do matters for the future.
Where was that quote from, did you say?
His name is Thomas Berry.
Like berry, like the fruit?
Berry, like the fruit, yeah.
Insinq, did he have an answer as well?
Oh, I didn't come up with something definitive, but I was thinking, I don't have my hands on a concept per se, but what came to mind was, in the first part of Process and Reality, the way he introduces the general set of problems and clarifies the misunderstandings that are directed towards the kind of territory he's trying to talk about, I think is really not only really articulate and on the money, but also very needed, I think, as a remediary or antidote to attitudes that I see floating around quite prevalently in consciousness today, social consciousness today, which is, thoughts along the lines of the kind of thing that Whitehead's trying to do is really just a waste of time. It doesn't amount to anything. It never achieves anything. It doesn't, And I think he dealt with that expertly. So I don't know. I'd have to reread it to zero in on a specific concept, but that's what came to mind.
To paraphrase what you said, in that first chapter of Process and Reality, he lays out a method for doing speculative philosophy that's rigorous, that's logically grounded, empirically grounded, and that shows its importance for the project of civilization.
Yeah, absolutely.
I would love to come back to a concept you brought up just to explore a little bit more, and that's the concept of the societies. And I think nexus as well is another term used to describe kind of collection of actual occasions. I was curious, is there some kind of rule that makes a society or nexus possible? For example, Leibniz had this idea of compossibility, where things that are actual are only things that are possible and compatible with what already exists. And I was curious if Whitehead had something similar.
Yeah, he definitely does. In the process of concrescence, where I was describing how, there are physical prehensions of the past that get integrated with conceptual prehensions of alternative possibilities. Whitehead has this term, eternal objects, something like Platonic forms, but different in an important way, for those alternative possibilities that are conceptually prehended. And what's realized, what's ingressed from that realm of possibility, Whitehead would say, has to be compatible with what's already occurred in the already actualized world, in what he would call the physical pole, and what's being physically prehended by an actual occasion. And so Leibniz's idea of compossibility is very much inspiration for Whitehead's thinking in those same terms about the compatibility of not only possibilities with one another, because there are certain, just as pure possibilities, there are certain eternal objects that can't be realized at the same time. Like you can't have a square circle, for example. But then there are also incompatibilities with regard to what possibilities can be squared with what's already been actualized. Like I'm not going to sprout wings and fly out the window. Even if I might imagine it would be great to do so, it's not going to happen.
Not today.
I'm wondering if you could maybe clarify a term he uses, positive versus negative prehensions.
Yeah, so we experience moment by moment the entire universe, and for the purposes of actualizing a coherent, harmonious, unique perspective on that universe, a lot of the feelings and the prehensions that are streaming in from the past environment need to be, the volume needs to be turned down. They need to be negatively prehended, so that we can then emphasize what matters to us and what we find valuable as an ingredient in the unified, harmonious perspective that we're trying to achieve. Now, what's important to note here is that just because we negatively prehend one of these feelings that's streaming in, just because we turn the volume down really low, it's not that it still contributes to the emotional tone of our final experience.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah,
so
that's
it's not just being eliminated.
Mm-hmm. The reason I brought it up is because I was thinking, in relation to what you were saying, that what I understood him to be proposing is almost like it's an inclusion by exclusion. And I like your characterization of turning the volume down. That's a good way, I think, of picturing what he's talking about, because it enters into as a way of being not relevant, basically.
That's right. Yeah. He even talks about negative prehensions leaving a scar. We might forget, but that forgotten memory is still functioning in the unconscious, and so it's almost like there's a whole theory of trauma here.
Oh yeah, repression.
Whitehead's and repression. Yeah. So there's a lot to these negative prehensions.
I was gonna try and draw parallels between psychology and what these processes that actual occasions are doing. And yet you use the idea of unconscious is great. Does Whitehead get specific with a kind of his own psychology emerging from his model?
As in, does he develop his own psychology out of his metaphysics?
Or use the like an isomorphic structure of actual occasions in human beings?
Yeah, I mean, so I mentioned William James as an important influence on Whitehead earlier, and in some sense, Whitehead is taking James's psychology and drawing out its cosmological implications. And James does that himself, especially in his last work, A Pluralistic Universe. But Whitehead's systematizing James's psychology and unpacking, all of its metaphysical ingredients that, with James, it's like you get the baked cake and I think it tastes great. But Whitehead's reversing the process and saying, okay, well, here's all the ingredients that went into that cake and here's the order you need to mix them together. Here's what the universe has to be like in order for William James's psychology to make sense. And so Whitehead didn't really need to develop his own psychology because it's already there. I mean, in some sense, his cosmology developed out of James's, Whitehead's cosmology developed out of James's psychology. So, but William James was also an important influence on Carl Jung. And so there's a way that I think we can very easily apply Whitehead's process philosophy to deepen and enrich our understanding of Carl Jung's analytic or depth psychology and the whole notion of the unconscious, collective unconscious, archetypes. Like there's a way of understanding all of that in Whiteheadian terms for sure.
I'm really curious now how would you frame in Whiteheadian terms Jung's concept of the self with a capital S?
That's God in Whitehead. And Whitehead has a conception of God as having two poles. God's an actual entity, right? And every actual entity is dipolar. There's a physical and a mental pole. And so God's mental pole is what Whitehead calls the primordial nature of God, and God's physical pole is the consequent nature of God. And so we can think of Jung's idea of the self as kind of lure that guides the development of the psyche towards greater wholeness, right? Now, in Whitehead's view, in some sense, the whole pluriverse, this pluralistic universe, is occurring inside of God. But God's not, that doesn't mean that God is outside of it. God is just as much in the world as the world is in God. We could describe it either way. But that the role that God plays with these two poles, physical and mental pole, is very much analogous to the self, as a kind of lure towards ever deeper, richer harmonization. And this, for Whitehead, would be, again, a cosmological process, that the whole evolutionary arc of the universe is in some sense not determined by, but lured and inspired by this divine harmony. And, Jung was specifically talking about the human psyche when he would refer to the self, but there's a way in which the process of individuation he was describing would allow the human being to become, if not one with the universe, then at least enter into a more intimate relationship with the whole of things. So, process theology, which is what Whitehead's idea of God is often referred to as having inspired, is very much, I think, one of the best ways I've found to spell out the metaphysical and theological implications of Jung's psychology. And I mean, Jung does a pretty good job doing that himself, but Jung's always limited by his hesitance to breach the Kantian sort of epistemological limitations. Jung would always say, I'm just a phenomenologist, and I'm talking about the archetype of the self, but it's totally based on what I've observed in my patients and in myself, and whatever might be going on metaphysically or cosmologically, like, don't ask me. Of course, when he's in a different, more speculative mood, Jung has a ton to say about what's going on beyond just, phenomenology.
He has opinions, but it's more what he would consider personal knowledge from experience, not scientifically.
Science.
Not something that he would consider, science.
I'd love to talk more about Whitehead's conception of God. Something that you mentioned was that Whitehead's God is an actual entity. And I'm curious, does he or would you put labels like infinite or eternal, or like how does Whitehead conceptualize God as both an actual entity or is it like the collection of all actual entities at the same time, or how are actual entities that aren't God and God as an actual entity, how do you relate those things?
Yeah. So, like all actual entities, God is dipolar, like I was saying before. And so there's a sense in which, and there's a ancient tradition of negative theology where paradox and the coincidence of opposites becomes the best means we have for describing the divine nature. And so Whitehead would say that the primordial nature of God is eternal, and the consequent nature of God is temporal. Why is that? Well, the primordial nature is what Whitehead, that's the mental pole of God, and that is God providing some valence or order, aesthetic order to the realm of infinite possibilities. And it's that envisagement of possibility, as Whitehead would put it, by the primordial nature of God, that allows for all finite actual occasions to then have some relevant sense of possibility or novelty in each unique situation that they arise within. So that's the role of the primordial nature. The consequent nature then, as the temporal part, and also, Whitehead would say that the primordial nature is alone and one in a sense, whereas the consequent nature is together with the world and is in a sense, the collection of the community of all of the occasions, actual occasions, finite actual occasions that have ever arisen. So the role of the consequent nature is to gather together everything that happens and in some way make that multiplicity harmonious. And so there's this tension between these two poles of God. Whitehead doesn't want there to be two gods, but it's paradoxical to understand how his conception of the divine can be both eternal and historical, how it can be both alone and with the world. He says also that the primordial nature of God is unconscious, and the consequent nature of God becomes conscious because of its relationship with the world. You could think of the primordial nature as just this sort of unconscious yearning that again gives some kind of a structure or creates a hierarchy of value in relationship to infinite possibility that then informs and lures all the finite actual occasions. But they're not determined by that primordial envisagement. Finite occasions make their own decisions. But whatever they decide, the consequent nature finds a way of harmonizing with that, bringing it back into some sense of ever ongoing unification, right? And so God grows with the world in Whitehead's scheme. Part 5 of Process and Reality is where he lays this out, and it's all of a sudden he goes from part 4, which is all that Mario-topological stuff that's hard to follow, to the most poetic part of the book, which is not as conceptually clear because, again, he's dealing with a mystical experience ultimately that's steeped in, when we try to articulate it, all of these paradoxes and seeming contradictions.
The primordial nature of God feels like, maybe you can correct me here, it feels like infinite possibility space of some kind.
Yeah, but God is also the sort of principle of limitation on possibility because of the way that the valuation of infinite possibility orders that realm of possibilities, gives it a vector, a valence, a kind of...
Is that a teleology or more like an omega point, like a great attractor of some kind?
Yeah, it's kind of like omega, but interestingly, Teilhard de Chardin has the omega at the end, whereas Whitehead's is kind of at the beginning. But the primordial and consequent natures feed back on one another. So we don't want to think of this as a temporal order, that like the primordial nature is like at the beginning of the universe or something, and the consequent nature is at the end of the universe. I think Whitehead means there's a logical ordering here, but not a temporal ordering. And sometimes in Teilhard's view of the omega point, it seems like a historical order.
I keep thinking of Plato's forms, and especially the Neoplatonist tradition, and the notion of the one and all of the forms as being somehow an emergence or an overflowing of the one. Which I was thinking about earlier, because you were talking about the sort of two different aspects of Whitehead's God, and it made me think of a book called Great book, which explores actually a similar tension that's in the historically received philosophical conception of God prevalent in the Abrahamic traditions, to do with, on the one hand, his supposed self-sufficiency, and on the other hand, the overflowingness and the fecundity that in some sense requires other things, but then the whole rationale for it is that he's self-sufficient, doesn't need other things, but similar kind of tension. But I wanted to ask, what because you mentioned that there's an important way that eternal objects differ from Platonic form. What is that?
Good. Yeah, so in Plato, his eternal forms, his ideas, eidos, which I think is one of the part of the title of your podcast, they are the preeminent realities, the preeminent actualities. The physical world, everything that we experience through our senses for Plato, everything that we feel and perceive is a kind of imitation, a mimicry, a copy. What's that?
A sad one.
A sad copy of the reality, the original, which is often some Platonic heaven. Now, to be fair to Plato, we usually talk about Plato's theory of forms, but Plato wrote. I always say to my students, Plato wrote dialogues, not doctrines.
Exactly.
And all the best refutations of the idea of ideas are also in Plato's dialogues.
Exactly.
So it's a compelling idea. There's a good argument to be had between Platonic realists who think universals pre-exist concrete things, so to speak, and nominalists who think that what we think of as universals are really just names, general categories that we abstract from experiences of particulars. There are ways that I think the nominalist critique of some versions of Platonic realism are important and valid. We want to avoid essentialisms and so on. But at the same time, it's hard to make any sense of mathematics without taking Platonic realism seriously. And so because he was a mathematician, and because he wanted to provide some justification for knowledge, definite knowledge, which presupposes that we can recognize and identify enduring objects across time, Whitehead needed this aspect of his scheme, this category that he calls eternal objects. But unlike Plato's forms, eternal objects, he says, they're deficient in actuality. They're not causes of anything. They don't do anything. He has what he calls the ontological principle, which is basically actual occasions are the only reasons, the only causes. All the agency is with the actual occasions of experience and not with the eternal objects. It's the actual occasions that draw upon or ingress the eternal objects. And so this is almost an inversion of Plato. But importantly, in inverting Plato, Whitehead is maintaining the importance of having this category of real ideas, as it were, or that it's not as easy as saying that his eternal objects are just universals, because of course there are particular eternal objects, so we have to be careful with our words here. But he did think it was important and necessary, again, to justify our knowledge, that we be able to make reference to eternal objects. And what that means is that, he gave the example of Cleopatra's Needle, which is in London on the Thames, I believe. Physically speaking, at the molecular and atomic level, the statue is made of marble. I believe that it's constantly losing little bits and gaining other bits, and dirt's accumulating. And so he's like, if we're going to be fussily exact about it, that physical entity, the enduring structure, at a material level is never the same twice. It's constantly wasting away. And indeed, in World War, not sure if it was one or two, probably World War II, it was damaged by a bomb, so it's, physically speaking, it's never the same twice, but yet we are able to visit it on multiple occasions throughout our lives and say, oh, there it is again. What is it that we're referring to? Whitehead would say, well, it's this complex eternal object that we're recognizing that is, yes, abstract, and yet we're also able to recognize it participating in this physical society, to use his term, or nexus. And so that, for Whitehead, is how we salvage the idea of having definite knowledge of enduring things that we can recognize across different occasions of our lives. because, if we live in a universe that's just awash in process and relationship and nothing is the same twice, it would start to become really difficult to understand how knowledge is possible. How do we have science? How do we make precise measurements? And so that's one of the reasons that Whitehead found it necessary to introduce this category of eternal objects.
What do you think the word category means to Whitehead? Because the section on categories I found very confusing, I must confess. Especially the section called categories of explanation. Weirdly, it strikes me that it's a series of assertions, not many of which have anything to do with explanation in their nature. I found that section really, I don't understand really there must be a rationale, but I'm not privy to it.
Well, he says that his, first chapter, after the first part of Process and Reality, which is the categorical scheme, the first chapter was the method of speculative philosophy that we spoke about earlier. But after that, it gets pretty incomprehensible. But he warns you that it will be that way, and that these categories will only make sense when he applies them in parts 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 of the book, where he brings the categories to bear on the special sciences like physics and biology and physiology and psychology, religious experience and so on. And so they're not supposed to make sense yet. And the order of presentation of his book, Process and Reality, is not the same as the order of composition. In other words, the order that he wrote it. For him to produce those categories, he first had to carefully analyze all of these various disciplines of human knowledge and human experience, from science to art to spiritual and religious experience, and see what generic principles he could abstract from, right? And that's where these categories are coming from. The category is just a general principle.
Well, that's the bit I find confusing, because some of it seems like it really is category in the usual sense. So creativity strikes me. So I think of category as like a box in which to put things. That's basically my mental picture of a category. And so some of what he talks about and labels category seems genuinely to be a category. And the thing I find confusing as well is like the stuff on explanation, the actual content of it is quite lucid. The whole scheme and all the applications of it that I've read so far, it all makes a lot of sense to me. I just don't get, that just doesn't seem like the stuff in the category of explanation, I think it's called, that section, just doesn't seem like a series of categories. And so I was wondering, I guess, whether category maybe has a wider sense for Whitehead than the lay sense that I'm operating under, or...
Yeah, I mean, there are some instances where category means like a box to put things in. I think Whitehead's imagining categories more as like the ways that things function. So it's like a category is an account of the function that together with other functions can help elucidate our concrete experience in some way. And so it's not just a box to put things in. It's more like a hammer to hammer nails.
Would you say categorical principle? Because I think that seems like a reasonable characterization of a lot of the assertions that appear in that section of the categories of explanation. It's a series of explanation. I mean, of assertions. Not the thing again I find confusing is not all of them are related to what I would normally think of as explanation, but certainly there are a set of principles that I can see playing a constitutive role in, say, the formative processes that are at play in the world.
Yeah, I mean, with the categories of explanation, it's like these are a result of him trying to carefully think through the process of concrescence and to understand, what makes logical sense How do I avoid any contradictions in my reasoning? How do I make sure that all of this is coherent, that there aren't, ideas whose definitions are arbitrary, but that there's a kind of systematic interlinking of how these various terms are defined, like actual occasions and eternal objects are defined in terms of one another, which is what he would mean by coherence. And also, these categories of explanation are meant to be not just logically sound, but empirically adequate. And so it's, I don't know how many, there are like 27 of them or something.
Yeah.
There could have been more, there could have been less. I think he's trying to signal to us that this is an open-ended process of speculative inquiry. It's a kind of speculative empiricism, and that we should continue to refine these categories. And actually, 3/4 of the way through the book, he decides abruptly to abolish one of the categories of existence. Actually, and so
I guess I haven't got to that part yet.
yeah, he just subsumes it into he realizes it's a special case of a more general category, and so he's exemplifying his method in doing that halfway, 3/4 of the way through the book, so that if he's not even taking his system as finished, then
of course, yeah,
nor should we.
I mean, it seems like, due to the nature of what he's proposing, it doesn't lend itself to the sense of a finished system, because what it proposes is a world that is always transcending whatever representational, is always growing, is always adding to itself, becoming novel, and it's hard to see how you could have a complete representational theory of what that's going to look like, when the whole principle is that it's, always kind of becoming something more and something new.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. The philosophy should be as open and creative as the universe.
Yeah. I actually have, I guess what you would call it is a summary of what I've understood so far from Process and Reality. And I was kind of hoping maybe I could read it out and you could tell me what you think, and if there's particular aspects that aren't necessarily right, you can give me some pointers. And with that sound good? Okay. So there's a little bit of poetic language. That's just a bit of how I write. But well, first of all, do you think it's fair to call the philosophy of organism a sort of phenomenology first metaphysics?
If we mean phenomenology first, if we mean by that it's rooted in experience, sure. But if we mean technically phenomenological and the method that Husserl develops, I think there's some important differences.
I mean, specifically what I mean is, I usually think of metaphysics as being to do with the general principles that have to be true in order for what we observe to be the case, I suppose. So I suppose the way I see Whitehead's metaphysics is, take as the basic organizing principle the interiority, the experience, and then kind of make the assumption that that's what everything is like, and then it's like an outworking of that. That's kind of how I.
Yeah, in that sense, that's definitely accurate. Yeah.
I'm sorry, Instinct, before you start, I just wanted to check in because we've got about 10 minutes left before it's been an hour and 45. And just want to check, Matt, how are you going? Like, do you feel like you need to stop soon, or happy to go over 10, 15, or how's your belly?
I mean, I could go another 15 minutes or so a little past the top of the hour, but definitely I'm getting hungry. So as much as I'm enjoying this, my coherence will start to diminish pretty soon.
That's fair. Yeah, well, we can organize another chat if you're open to that. I'd love to.
Of course.
There's so many more questions. I feel it's hard to fit everything in.
I feel like we've only just started to scratch the surface,
Well, happy to do a part 2 and a part 3 and onward forever.
Cool.
As long as I last. So.
Yeah, so this is what I came up with. The universe is ultimately a process, not a thing, and the nature of that process is the perpetual realization of complexity in service to the evolution of novelty. That the heartbeat of existence consists in the moment of unification, which is occasioned by the inclusion of every entity, actual or not, in the concrescence whereby one is added to the sum, which with each beat of the heart of existence, the prior superject is assimilated and immortalized by the new. The subject becomes an object to the new subject, and in this way each prior state accrues and contributes to the current pinnacle of novelty. And I guess as a kind of yeah, I guess I think of concrescence as almost like a moment of crystallization. And I wonder, like, is there an in between? Yeah, this is part of a question I think that's been developing throughout the conversation in my mind is, is it a succession of actual occasions, or is, because I kind of am in some sense oscillating myself between a picture of it where it oscillates between concrescence and some intermediary state. I don't know what that would be though, right? Which is like where the concrescence dies and passes away and becomes the formation state for a new concrescence. But I almost get the sense that there's no gap in there, space to breathe there, that the concrescence dies at the moment that it becomes a new concrescence or something like that. So yeah, I'm curious how that landed with you.
These are the sorts of questions. I mean, first of all, your description you read was beautiful. Admirably put. I wish I had written it. But this is one of the questions that you raised that I think Whiteheadian scholars dig into and disagree with each other about. It's a fertile area of research. Whitehead himself does note, he describes two different types of process. Concrescence is one and transition is the other. And, he says, this is an intellectual analysis of an unbroken process of becoming. And so let us not mistake the order of explanation. Like for him, the concrete always explains the abstract and not the reverse. That said, he, in describing these two types of process, is trying to do justice both to the importance of individuals, the microcosm, as it were, and the way that the universe becomes unique in each particular. But he also wants to do justice, and I think this is where the process of transition becomes important, to the macrocosmic, to not just the individual, but the universal, the not just each, but all. And transition is the process whereby what was just unified now becomes one of the many again. And so we need to distinguish between these two types of process. And we don't want to get in the mistake of imagining that what's being described here is a spatio-temporal kind of movement, right, where there might be like empty space between this concrescence here and this concrescence there.
No.
Yeah, I know you weren't implying that, but it's easy for us to imagine that that's what we're trying to talk about here.
Yeah, actually, the metaphor that comes to mind is breathing. Beating the heart is another one, but breathing, the in-out, expansion, contraction, because it strikes me that the unification into the one that happens in the moment of concrescence is, I don't know, that strikes me as contraction. And then the kind of becoming again one of the many strikes me as expansion.
Beautiful. Yeah. That is a breathing process. Yeah.
I'm curious, Matt, how your ideas of today have moved past or through Whitehead and like where you maybe disagree now, or that you've sort of changed your mind about different things.
I don't know that I could do better. I'm not about to like write my own version of process of reality with my, actually I could do better with my own metaphysical scheme. But I hold Whitehead's categories lightly, as he himself did, right? But I think with him, and I think with other thinkers, I mean, probably, the German idealist Friedrich Schelling is also an important influence on me and is, quite convergent with Whitehead. A few hundred years, well, about 100 years before, 150 or so before Whitehead, with his very evolutionary cosmological vision. And I have so many important teachers, and when I try to think about what I think, it's hard to differentiate what's my idea versus the influences I've had. But I think for me,
what if we frame it using the concept of development? Not so much say coming up with something new, but in what way have you carried it forward? Say,
sure. Well, as I enter into my final late 30s and get older and turn towards the second half of life, I'm beginning to feel a transition in my own development in my own thinking from being mostly concerned and interested in the natural sciences and interested in more abstract metaphysical integrations of all the special sciences, and I'm increasingly interested in the human being and in these questions of meaning in life, and I've been finding, if not answers, at least interesting questions to help me explore, like what is the human being, what is the meaning of our existence in various sort of esoteric traditions, like anthroposophy, for example, coming out of the work of Rudolf Steiner, who in a way is inheriting German idealism and taking it further. And, just to give one example of the way in which I think we're at this evolutionary bottleneck moment as a species, and the secular materialist story of technological progress and consumer capitalism is like the be all and end all, the end of history, as Fukuyama said. Like that, it seemed like that was it in the 90s, and then for the last couple of decades, that has totally collapsed, and nothing new has emerged to replace it. And so these questions of human meaning and how we are to rediscover a more viable, like deep motivational structure to guide our existence, and to understand what are the further reaches of human evolution, like where are we headed? To think that we're pinnacle of evolution, I think is naive, but at the same time, I feel like we do have a unique potential as human beings. As the Buddhists would say, it's an auspicious occasion to be incarnated as a human being. And so what are we capable of? These are the questions I'm interested in. What sorts of transpersonal development lie ahead for us, and in what ways can we consciously decide to take action so as to further that process along? And so that has, to me, that less to do with like understanding all the knowledge that's available and trying to integrate it, which is what it's what I'm still very interested in that. But knowledge seems, when I look at the trajectory of my own life and the fact that I'm going to die one day, human mortality, any answer to the meaning of life has to reckon with that inevitability. Knowledge and intellectual understanding seems less and less valuable.
Right.
Right.
There's actually, I have an essay called True Philosophy, where I talk about a distinction that I make between living and dead philosophy. And in the essay, I use a quote that I wanted to read out. It's from Kierkegaard, but it really resonates with what you were just saying. What I really need is to get clear about what I am to do, not what I must know, except insofar as knowledge must precede every act. What matters is to find my purpose, to see what it really is that God wills that I shall do. The crucial thing is to find a truth that is truth for me, to find the idea for which I am willing to live and die. Of what use would it be to me to discover a so-called objective truth, to work through the philosophical systems so that I could, if asked, make critical judgments about them, could point out the fallacies in each system? Of what use would it be to me to develop a theory of the state, getting details from various sources and combining them into a whole, and constructing a world I did not live in, but merely held up for others to see?
Love that. Yeah.
Yeah. There's something that was in that passage that brought up a question for me. It was about finding answers from God. And we talked earlier about, in Whitehead's view, God having this kind of hierarchy of value and this, teleology or some kind of guidance. And I'm curious if you feel like you've received guidance from Whitehead's work in that specific way of like finding, some kind of, I don't know, enlightenment or some kind of guide towards what a human being is, purpose on Earth is to do. And does Whitehead get explicit with that kind of thing, or have you kind of pulled that out yourself from his work?
Yeah. What I just wanted to quickly expand on the question and say, it doesn't have to be necessarily something that Whitehead, I think, is explicit about. I'd be interested as well if there's something that you have derived in terms of applying Whitehead's ideas of relating to the world in your own life, whether that's been fruitful for you in some way in that respect.
Yeah, that's a great question to have arrived at after 2 hours of getting into all the metaphysical minutiae. I will quote Whitehead first before I talk about how it's affected my personal experience, because he says in his book Adventures of Ideas, he says the teleology of the universe is directed to the production of beauty. And so his conception of the divine is as the ultimate aesthete. It's an aesthetic vision that the divine is trying to realize, and morality is a subset of aesthetics. Whitehead says God seeks intensity of experience. God does not seek to preserve already established modes of experience, but to push us further, or lure, I should say, to pull us, beckon us forward. And also, not only is morality a subset of aesthetics for Whitehead, but so is logic. This is one of the preeminent mathematical logicians in the world, and maybe world history, saying that logic is a subset of aesthetics. So there's an aesthetic order to the universe, and moral and mathematical forms of order are outgrowths of that. Maths is music in a sense. And, how this affects me personally, I find it deeply inspiring. And I've been on a journey in my life from the kind of less, I would say, overly restrictive form of Christianity and Judaism, at least my grandparents on my dad's side, and Christianity coming from my mom, and became a pretty obnoxious materialist atheist in my teens, and then discovered the psychology of religion, and through Carl Jung, and read some Alan Watts, and got interested in Buddhism and Taoism and Zen, but then, as I went through my 20s, had some experiences and started to think more deeply about the importance of personal type of divinity, and all of a sudden, in studying like esoteric and mystical forms of Christianity, this whole idea of incarnation started to resonate with me more deeply than it had before. And so Whitehead's idea of God, as he puts it, the fellow sufferer who understands, just touched me in a way. This isn't, Whitehead's God is not omnipotent anymore, and not above the world, ruling it with, decrees as some kind of a dictator, but rather involved with the world, feeling the pain and the joy of every occasion of experience, and trying to offer some sense of what's possible. And that feels to me like it's not just a description of my experience, but it seems adequate as a description of my experience, but it's also an invitation to give expression to experience so as to further the vision he's providing, right? So there's like a participatory element to it, and there's a sense in which he's saying God needs our help, and I find that compelling.
Yeah.
For some people, they're like, I want God to be in charge and like make it all okay. I'm like, that's such a boring, inadequate way of understanding human life. Like, what's there for us to do if God's already in charge? And why should there be evil? I mean, if God's actually omnipotent, then I'm fucking pissed at that God.
Yeah.
That's really beautifully put. And it kind of makes me think that we're all gods in the making, and God wants allies rather than
Yes.
slaves or worshippers.
Right. That's well
Maybe,
said.
Yeah. Well,
maybe.
sorry.
Sorry, go on and sing.
I just wanted to say, I lost the phrasing for a second, but I was thinking the same thing. I was specifically thinking that, it's almost like God is trying to nurture us towards being co-creators,
Right. Not jealously guarding power, but saying, here, like, let's do this.
Yeah, that just gave me goosebumps. So, that's something I associate with synchronicity. So that, for me, that's resonance.
Maybe that's a good time to wrap up and let Matt to his dinner. And
Good idea.
thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure to have you on, and talk all things becoming. Until next time. Thank you so much.
Definitely.
Yeah, and definitely let's do a next time. This was great. I love being able to talk to other people who have, spent some time with Whitehead's text, because we could give each other goosebumps talking about it, right? That's what it's all about.
Definitely, man.
Hey, thank you.
Yeah.